with gratitude to Fort James Corporation for significant support of this presentation.
The story of Wisconsin begins near Green Bay, where many clues to the past can still be found. Join Jenna and I as we tell you the story of Old Green Bay.
Have people lived in Wisconsin for a long time?
Would you believe that archaeologists have found evidence of people living throughout Wisconsin as long as 11,000 years ago? We know this because they left behind objects like stone tools buried deep in the ground. Until 1634, only Native American people lived here, people like the woodland tribes of the Menominee and the Ho-Chunk, also called Winnebago. The land was covered with thick forests and plentiful animal life. Change came when explorers from Europe began arriving in the New World. For thousands of years, Native Americans lived on this forest land. When the Europeans came, everything began to change. The French, who settled in eastern Canada, were anxious to explore this unknown land to the west. They wanted the valuable furs of the forest animals. A French explorer named Jean Nicolet came by canoe from Quebec, Canada, into Lake Michigan. Nicolet wanted to make contact with the native people willing to trade furs for goods. He was also looking for a water route to China. No one knew the American continent was so large that a huge ocean had to be crossed before reaching China. When Nicolet arrived on the shore of what is now called Green Bay, the Ho-Chunk, Potawatomi, and Menominee may have welcomed him. Nicolet promptly claimed their land in the name of France. This visit was described in a missionary's diary. He wore a grand robe of China damask, all strewn with flowers and birds of many colors. No sooner did they perceive him than the women and children fled at the sight of a man who carried thunder in both hands, for thus they called the two pistols he held. A robe like Nicolet put on for this occasion is displayed at the Neville Museum. So are pistols like he used. A statue of Nicolet overlooks Red Banks, where he may have landed just 14 years after the Pilgrims came to America. When visiting the Brown County Courthouse, you are greeted at the entrance with a painting of Nicolet landing near Green Bay. Before he returned to Canada, Nicolet spent the winter living with the native people, exploring the area. This friendship set a foundation for future fur trading. Even though the French put it off for another 30 years, they didn't know that this was part of a great water route through the continent.
Who came after Nicolet?
The next people to arrive were fur traders brought by French-Canadian boatmen called voyageurs. These French traders were very anxious for furs. Beaver were especially valuable because they were sold to make fashionable hats in Europe. The voyageurs and traders made contact with Menominee, Ho-Chunk, and Potawatomi nations as they moved through the rivers in canoes and flat-bottom boats. With furs from the Native Americans piled high in the center of the boat, the voyageurs often sang as they paddled. Voyageur Park in De Pere is named for these adventurers. Before long, the French-Canadian governor sent Nicolas Perrot to bargain with the tribes for French control of the waterways. Perrot was successful in uniting many tribes in an agreement to trade furs with the French instead of with their rivals, the English. Anxious to convert Native Americans to the Catholic religion, the French Jesuits sent Father Claude Alloway to the area in 1669. A bark chapel at Heritage Hill State Park is like the one Father Alloway used. He and other priests were respected by the Indians because black robes helped them get fair trades. But most Indians did not become Catholics. A sculpture stands on the Brown County Courthouse lawn honoring this early time of French contact. Father Alloway, Nicolas Perrault, and a leader of the Fox Nation stand together. Father Alloway built a mission building named St. Francis Xavier near the rapids of the Fox River, which the French call Les Rapides des Pères. This means the Rapids of the Fathers. Today we call this place De Pere. A marker on the Claude Alloway Bridge in De Pere is a reminder of the mission site that once stood on the shore. The mission was a busy place where Native Americans, fur traders, and explorers stopped for supplies, rest, and trade. Because Nicolas Perrault used Father Alloway's mission as his headquarters, Perrault thanked him with a gift of a silver altarpiece called an ostensorium. When the mission was attacked and burned, the altarpiece was buried in the ground and saved. This rare and valuable reminder of Old Green Bay can still be seen at the Neville Museum. Change came to the economy of the Native American tribes when they began to hunt for trade with the French instead of for survival. Metal tools, knives, ornaments, and guns were useful, so they traded furs for them. The French gained pelts of beaver, otter, marten, mink, fox, wolf, bear, wildcat, muskrat, deer, and skunk. A very old fur trader's book records this trading activity. Although the traders brought new tools to the native people, they also unknowingly brought disease. Many Indians died because they had no immunity to European diseases. After Perrault left the area, conflict developed between the Fox Nation and the French. The Fox tried to protect their land by keeping the fur traders away. By blocking waterways between Canada and the Mississippi River, they succeeded in slowing French fur trade for 40 years. By the late 1600s, the French were calling this area La Baie Verte, which means Green Bay. It was soon shortened to La Baie, and that was the name used for many years.
So, who did the land really belong to?
That is a good question, Jenna. Deciding who owned the land remained a problem for many years. The Menominee and the Ho-Chunk considered this land near La Baie sacred and theirs to care for. But the French explorers also claimed it in the name of their king. Because of this disagreement over ownership of the land, the French established a fort near the mouth of the Fox River. At different times it was called Fort Pierre, Fort St. Francis, and Fort La Baie. It was a French base for fighting the Fox Indians, who were defending their right to the land. After years of battle in other parts of Wisconsin and Illinois, the French drove away the Fox Nation and claimed the land. When the French became involved in wars with the British, called the French and Indian Wars, they lost all interest in Fort La Baie. Those wars should have been called the French and British Wars because they were not Indian wars. And the battles were in Europe and Eastern America, not in Wisconsin. When the French were finally defeated, the little outpost of La Baie became British. When the British took over the ruins of the fort, they renamed it Fort Edward Augustus. Many of the French fur traders chose to stay in La Baie and live under British rule rather than leave. They continued trading furs since the British formed partnerships with the experienced French traders. When these British troops were sent away to fight elsewhere, they never returned. For many years, the small La Baie outpost remained French in language and custom. The people, after all, were still mostly French traders, not British. During this time, the Yankees in Eastern America were not happy under British colonial rule. They wanted independence and fought the American Revolution, led by George Washington. The United States of America was founded on July 4th, 1776. In La Bay, people knew little about the war, and no fighting took place near this remote outpost. La Bay became a part of the United States at the end of the Revolutionary War. But most of the people in La Bay didn't know about it, and the British refused to give up their claim to La Bay.
Settlers must have built homes in La Bay.
For years, fur traders just passed through. But some traders like Charles de Langlade stayed in La Bay. He is such an important early settler that some people call him the father of Wisconsin. Because of his influence with the Native Americans, the British, and the French, Charles de Langlade's fur trading business grew. His house, trading post, and a small settlement were on what is now Washington Street. De Langlade's daughter, Domatilde, married her father's friend and employee, Pierre Grignot. Eventually, Grignot inherited his father-in-law's fur trade business. He passed it on to his 7 sons. They all had a good life because of their control of the fur trade in La Bay. De Langlade was buried where there is now a fire station. A stone marks the site of the old cemetery. Another fur trader, Joseph Leroy, built a house that was later lived in by trader Jacques Porlier and his wife. Otto Tonk and his wife were the next owners. Tonk was a Norwegian missionary and businessman who could afford the fine furnishings still seen in the house. The Leroy Porlier Tonk Cottage, named after these 3 early owners, can now be seen at Heritage Hill State Park. As the oldest surviving building in the state, it is a valuable reminder of old Green Bay. John Law was another early settler. He traded along the Wolf and Fox Rivers, becoming one of Wisconsin's important fur traders. Law built his house at the shore of the Fox River. He liked to keep an eye on the canoes bringing furs to his trading post nearby. Law's daughter Rachel married one of the Grignots, thus merging the de Langlade and Law fur trade families. Although it looks very different now. Imagine when Indians and traders once met here at Law's Landing. This is now the corner of Adams and Porlier Streets. Many reminders of the past are buried beneath the ground here.
Those traders must have been rich with all those furs.
That depends on what you call rich. Successful fur trade businesses provided a good living for the rough frontier. However, the traders began to lose money when the powerful John Jacob Astor opened a branch of his American Fur Company in La Bay. There were branches all along the major rivers and Great Lakes. Astor was very rich. Astor's company gave the fur traders and trappers the supplies they needed in exchange for mortgages on their land. This put the French-Canadian fur traders in debt to Astor's company. Astor gained control when the government passed a law restricting trade to only American citizens. Suddenly, the French traders couldn't pay their debt because they weren't allowed to trade furs in America anymore. In order to pay off what they owed, they had to give their land to Astor's company. To add to the problem, the animals were being trapped out. Even Astor's American Fur Company had to stop doing business in La Bay and concentrate instead on land sales. Astor owned so much foreclosed land from the French traders that his local partners founded the town of Astor on the east side of the Fox River. Even John Law ended up working for Astor, selling land. The town of Astor became a lovely residential area. It is now the Astor National Historic District and is a special place to find old Green Bay. Streets, schools, and parks in Green Bay are named for these early settlers.
If La Bay was French and then British, how did it become American?
Although La Bay was officially American after the Revolutionary War in 1783, it wasn't until the United States won another war against England called the War of 1812 that La Bay really became American. That happened when the United States finally took over the fort from the British. It was renamed Fort Howard after an American general. About 500 American soldiers sailed into La Bay in 3 large ships. The troops were sent to rebuild the fort and to protect the settlers. They were also sent to stop French Canadians and British from trading for furs. By this time, the La Bay settlement had grown to over 300 people, mostly French Canadian traders. They had to decide if they should stay and become American citizens. Most did. This began the gradual end of French influence in the settlement. Eventually, La Bay would be called by the English name Green Bay.
So, I wonder what Fort Howard was like.
You can find out a lot about life at Fort Howard by visiting Heritage Hill State Park. People dress and act as if they are living at that time. After the American soldiers rebuilt the fort, it became a center of activity for La Bay, offering medical assistance, religion, education, and a marketplace. Fort Howard helped make the area attractive for settlement by Americans from the East, called Yankees. They moved onto the land the government gained through treaties with the Menominee, Chippewa, and Ho-Chunk. A new fort commander, Colonel Smith, moved the troops to a hill 5 miles south, where Heritage Hill stands today. He considered this a better place because of the dry location and the river view. He called it Camp Smith. Settlers built shacks nearby along the riverbank. The troops called this settlement Shantytown. When Colonel Smith was relieved of duty, the military was moved back to the original site and called Fort Howard once again. However, the soldiers discovered that the fort buildings need replacement. Using sawn lumber instead of logs, they built a stockaded fort. 2 of these original fort buildings are at Heritage Hill State Park, the Fort Howard Hospital and the Barracks Kitchen. Another original fort building stands today on Maple Street as a private home. Because Fort Howard provided security, settlers formed villages nearby along the Fox River. These settlers were mostly Yankees. They brought a new way of life to Green Bay that replaced the French language, culture, and fur trade that dominated for over 200 years. American troops occupied Fort Howard until 1851, when the government closed it. All the fort buildings were moved or destroyed. Some of the land was sold to the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad for a passenger depot. Later, another depot was built there, and it still stands today. You can see a stone marker nearby that identifies the site where 3 countries once occupied a fort.
What happened to the Indians after so many settlers came?
Jenna, the Chippewa, Fox, Oneida, Stockbridge, Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee tribes were deeply affected by the settlers and by the United States government. A law called the Indian Removal Act tried to force tribes to move west to the Mississippi River. A leader of the Fox Nation named Black Hawk led his people to reclaim their land. The Black Hawk War resulted. Although no fighting took place near La Bay, settlers avoided the area during this time. Because they were pushed out of their New York land by settlers, a group of Oneida Indians, accompanied by Reverend Eleazar Williams, came to La Bay by steamboat. Reverend Williams helped negotiate with the Menominee to sell the Oneida some of the land on the west side of the Fox River. The Oneida still live on some of this land, now called the Oneida Nation Reservation. They continue to have a strong presence in the Green Bay area. In treaty after treaty, the government pressured the Indian nations for land. Some laws passed that allowed unjust takeover of the land, with little concern for the people. By the time Wisconsin became a state, the Indian nations had lost most of their Wisconsin land. Small pieces of this land were reserved for them, and these reservations are where many continue to live. Government land offices opened to sell former Indian land to settlers. One was in Green Bay. This began a time of enormous growth due to immigrant settlement on what was once Indian land.
Living near a river seemed like the best place to be.
Oh, you're right, Jenna. Along the Fox River, there were several villages competing for business and settlement. Menomineyville was planned by trader John Law near what is now the Wisconsin State Correctional Institution. However, it never became an important settlement. But Daniel Whitney and his wife developed a very important village called Navarino. It was on a swampland across the river from the fort. In Navarino, Daniel Whitney built a store, a warehouse, sawmill, and dock. He also made a log road that is still called Main Street. He built the Washington House Hotel near what is now the Port Plaza Mall, where a hotel still stands. Whitney named the streets of Navarino after the presidents and the trees of the region. Downtown Green Bay still has these street names. As Navarino grew, so did the Whitney wealth and influence. It was Daniel Whitney who built the beginnings of the city of Green Bay, exactly where downtown remains today. He has been called the father of Green Bay. Farther up the Fox River, Howell Wright and his wife established a homestead and an inn. Wright ran a ferry across the Fox River and eventually built the first bridge. The settlement that grew around his inn is now Wrightstown. Legend tells that Wright purchased his land from the profits he made by selling cats. Since cats were scarce and in demand as mousers, each kitten sold for a high price. William Dickinson planned the village of De Pere on the Fox River near the rapids where Father Alloway's mission once stood. Dickinson and his partners in the Fox River Hydraulic Company took advantage of the rapids' water power and had a dam built there. Because of the power from this dam, De Pere became a manufacturing center. The power company's original headquarters is now the White Pillars Museum. Homes of early villagers can be seen in the National Historic District of De Pere. One of the De Pere homes, called the Crow's Nest, is a place where elegant society and a president were entertained. There are even stories about a haunted third floor. The villages of Navarino, Astor, and De Pere were strong rivals for business and settlement. In order to gain power over De Pere, Astor and Navarino joined together in 1838 to become the city of Green Bay. Morgan L. Martin, a local lawyer, became president of the new Green Bay. Reminders of these settlements and their founders are not hard to find.
Are there other important people?
Yes, there are several very influential settlers. Baird, Arndt, and Doty. Henry Baird was an attorney who held many political offices. He was very involved with land sales and settling disagreements about the land. You can still see his law office at Heritage Hill. Elizabeth Baird's personal journal describing pioneer days is very good reading. She tells about everyday events, such as a boat trip where playful egg throwing between the group traveling in canoes continued on land when they camped. This spirited incident probably gave Egg Harbor its name. John Arndt came to La Bay with his wife and 6 children. He thought the Green Bay Harbor and the Fox River offered great opportunity. Arndt introduced the Durham boat to the area. Because the Durham was able to navigate the rapids and shallow waters found in Wisconsin rivers, travel improved. Arndt also operated the first ferry that connected the east and west sides of the Fox River at Green Bay. Arndt envisioned Green Bay as a great water transportation center. John Arndt was an active and successful businessman, making a fortune in businesses such as sawmills and shipbuilding. Arndt built a house for his daughter, Mary, and her husband, Captain John Cotton. Today, this house sits atop Heritage Hill, moved from its original farm site. Named Beaupre Place, it is sometimes referred to as the Cotton House. Judge James Doty and his wife were important settlers. He was an influential lawyer who brought new standards of law to the territory. An effective politician, Doty went on to become a Wisconsin territorial governor, a Utah territorial governor, and a United States congressman. James Doty was judge at the famous trial of Chief Oshkosh, and Henry Baird was the prosecuting attorney. Chief Oshkosh claimed that white man's laws were not binding on him because he was a Menominee acting according to tribal law. Chief Oshkosh was freed. Another important person is Little Fox, son of an Ottawa chief. While visiting, he single-handedly rescued a Menominee woman taken from her people. His daring earned him the honor of a Menominee name, Ashwaubenon, and the marriage to the chief's daughter. The village of Ashwaubenon and Ashwaubenon Park keep this memory today. Familiar public areas are named for Baird, Arndt, and Doty.
It must have been nice to live in LeBay.
Yes, Jenna, some settlers who bought land and began businesses were able to make a very good living and influence the growth of Green Bay. But settlement during the 1800s was far from easy. A severe depression called the Panic of 1837 made it especially difficult. Paper money was being printed by the banks because gold and silver were awkward to use. Because banks often printed more money than they should have, they helped bring on a financial crash. The closing of the Bank of Wisconsin and the Fox River Hydraulic Company contributed to economic hard times. Astor's American Fur Company closed when there were few furs left to trade. Fort Howard's closing was yet another blow. The displacement of Native American tribes from their land also made this an extremely difficult time. People often came with little and endured many hardships to make a life here. Only a few settlers were wealthy.
There aren't many forests left. What happened to them?
The forest disappeared because of lumbering. It all began with a few small sawmills. When John Arndt made a deal with the Menominee to log their lands, he was soon shipping lumber on boats to Chicago. As demand grew, Green Bay became a great lumber market, a shipping port, and a lumber milling center. Logging took place all over the area, and sawmills could be found in every town. The many logging camps needed supplies and equipment supplied by Green Bay area merchants and industry. Lumberjacks, sailors, and saloons made this a very busy place. The great pines floated on the waterways to market. Hardwoods did not float, so the pine forests were the first to go. When the railroad expanded into northern Wisconsin, timber could be shipped by railroad, and lumberjacks no longer depended on the spring thaw of the rivers to transport pine logs. Gradually, the forests were cleared of both pine and hardwood. They were not being replanted. Wisconsin's great forests were disappearing due to the waste and neglect of those who did not respect the land. The final disaster was the Peshtigo Fire, which devastated forests and homesteads, killing over 1,200 people and countless animals. Fires spread rapidly on both sides of the bay. Because of fire and lumbering, the forests were almost gone, as were many animals, like wolf and bear. This helped begin the slow clearing of land for another use, farming. Although the Oneida and other early settlers farmed, there was a great increase in farming when immigrants from European countries began moving into the Green Bay area. In 1840, there were only 18,000 people, mostly Yankees, in all of what was to become Wisconsin. 10 years later, there were 305,000 people, mostly Europeans, interested in farming the land. People were encouraged to come to Wisconsin to make a new life on the former Indian land that the government agents sold. Czech, Hollanders, Germans, Irish, and Scandinavians had settlements in northeast Wisconsin. Over the years, these immigrants gradually blended their traditions and values to make a new culture in the New World. A large number of Belgian immigrants came to Green Bay. These pioneer families worked long and hard, planting grain, vegetables, and potatoes. Wisconsin's first rural National Historic District is northeast of Green Bay. Over 100 buildings of the Belgian immigrants can still be found there. During the long winter, these Belgian families split and hand-carved cedar wood roof shingles. Long lines of ox-drawn sleds and wagons piled high with shingles traveled to market at Navarino and Dykesville. The frozen bay was also a busy road. A hotel was built on the ice for the many travelers with shingle sleds going to market. In the spring, the hotel had to be quickly dismantled before the ice melted. Immigrants often settled near others of similar heritage and religion. A large Belgian population still lives in northeast of Green Bay. The Polish are found northwest of Green Bay, and the Hollanders are still around De Pere. One way to find these ethnic groups is by traveling Wisconsin's Heritage Trail, marked with highway signs.
How did Wisconsin become a state?
Although Wisconsin may be an Indian word, records were not well kept years ago. Scholars do not know which Indian nation to credit with this word, nor are they sure of its meaning. Before it was a state, Wisconsin was first a territory, created in 1836. It included all of what is now Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa, as well as parts of North and South Dakota. The present boundaries of Wisconsin were set a few years later. Judge Doty's cousin, Morgan L. Martin, was largely responsible for Wisconsin's state constitution. Hazelwood, the home Morgan L. Martin built for his bride, is much as it was when they lived there, because it is preserved as a museum. A visit to Hazelwood gives you an interesting look at old Green Bay. A book detailing local history was written by the Martins' daughter, Deborah. You can find it in the library. When Morgan L. Martin's version of the Constitution was accepted by the people, Wisconsin was admitted to statehood on May 29, 1848, as the 30th state. The first governor of the new state was Nelson Dewey. Green Bay had grown to 2,000 people at that time.
The water around Green Bay seemed to be important.
You're right, Jenna, and the water is still important. For many years, water transportation was the best way to move products and people. A channel dredged in the Bay Harbor made it deeper, so large Great Lakes ships could come to Green Bay. Steamship traffic increased, and the busy harbor became what John Arndt had hoped for. Shipbuilding, fishing, and ice harvesting became valuable water industries. Morgan L. Martin also dreamed of making Green Bay a transportation center. He developed the Fox River Improvement Project. His plan was to create a water route for the larger boats to go from the Great Lakes up the Fox River to the Wisconsin River and then on to the Mississippi River until reaching the Gulf of Mexico. Morgan L. Martin's dream involved canals, dams, locks, and lots of money to build them. Because he was a very influential and wealthy man, Morgan L. Martin was able to make some of the dream come true. He oversaw the completion of the waterway from Green Bay to the Wisconsin River at Portage. Financial and engineering problems shattered Morgan L. Martin's plans to complete the project. He discovered that the Wisconsin River was not suited to steamboat traffic because there were too many shifting sandbars. The final blow came when the railroad crossed America and became the preferred transportation system. Even with Green Bay's new inland water route, the railroad took over. Water routes continued to be important, but mostly for Great Lakes shipping and recreational boating.
How did Green Bay become a city on both sides of the river?
Remember when Navarino and Astor joined together to become Green Bay on the east side of the river? Across the river, Joel Fisk and Francis Denoyer bought land from the abandoned Fort Howard. They called the area Howard. It soon became the city of Fort Howard on the west side of the Fox River. But there was no bridge that allowed people in the two cities to easily cross the Fox River. They could walk across the ice, or row a boat, or take a ferry to get to the other side. This river barrier contributed to an ongoing feud between the people living in Fort Howard and Green Bay. When the new railroad came to the west side of the river in Fort Howard, Green Bay wanted to use it. So Green Bay financed the building of a wooden bridge over the Fox River in order to get to the railroad on the west side. Although Green Bay and Fort Howard remained rivals for years, they finally joined together and became one in 1895 as the city of Green Bay. James Elmore was the first mayor of this new Green Bay on both sides of the river. As the city grew, more bridges crossed the Fox River. Public schools were established and churches flourished. Green Bay moved to a more modern life with trolleys, gas lights, and football. Green Bay football had its beginnings with a city team. It later became a professional team under Curly Lambeau, sponsored by a local meatpacking company. Today, the Green Bay Packers remain a unique professional team, proudly owned by the people of Green Bay.
Now Wisconsin is a dairyland, and there are lots of paper mills.
Milk, cheese, paper, and the Packers are well-known Wisconsin products. When the land was cleared of timber, grain crops were planted by the immigrants. German and Dutch settlers opened breweries using the grains they grew. Because the grain crops can deplete the soil, the farmers also began planting crops which could feed livestock. Many of these immigrants were experienced dairy farmers. Dairy herds grew, and Wisconsin gradually changed into a dairy land. Skilled immigrant cheesemakers established many small cheese factories. Eventually, Green Bay became a world cheese center. Although forest conservation was practiced in the Menominee woodlands, most of the lumbering industry was forced to change when the great pines and hardwoods were gone. Paper mills were established because less desirable logs could be used as pulp. A strong paper industry developed in Green Bay using pulp logs and the abundant water needed in paper making. John Hoberg began a paper mill in Green Bay with 12 workers. He gambled that steam power could run paper-making machines. Hoberg's little mill turned into a huge international business called Procter & Gamble. Another early paper mill opened at the De Pere Dam, using water power. Today, it is called Nicolet Paper. Many other paper mills developed all along the Fox River. Wisconsin's forests at one time supplied the fur trade, then lumbering, and finally paper making. The cleared forests provided land for farming and the grazing of dairy herds. The forests and their land were always a source of Green Bay's wealth. The great waterway flowing from the Fox River and the bay continues to be another source of wealth.
So, how do I find Old Green Bay?
It's really a matter of looking for it, Jenna. Despite the loss of many old buildings due to fire and decay and razing, many reminders of Old Green Bay can still be found. Look for the names of streets and schools, for village, park, and business names. Look for markers, monuments, and historic buildings. Look for sculptures and paintings that tell the stories of the past. Look for ethnic festivals like powwows. Look for the 11 Indian nations in Wisconsin, especially the neighboring Oneida and Menominee. Special foods are found here: cheese, bratwurst, fish boils, and booyah. Find our unique history preserved and displayed in museums and public buildings. Look for old restored homes and churches. Wisconsin's recorded history began in Green Bay. This past is forever woven into the future. History is being made now, and you are part of tomorrow's history. Old Green Bay is still here. You will find it if you look.
with gratitude to Fort James Corporation for significant support of this presentation.